Hey everyone, it's Phil Wade from Dalton Wade Real Estate Group. We're just about to get started. Just want to make sure everyone is able to hear me. So just kind of type in and let me know that everything is good. Hey Jill, hey Clint. We'll give it a hey Malika, how are you? Hey Kristen, hey Evelyn, hey Billy, hey Nicole, how are you? Great, you can hear me. Um, so as we all know, hey Sherry, hey Dominic, how are you? Just give it a minute or two and see if anybody else, hey Sylvia, if anybody else jumps on. Looks like we got about 27 people here in the room. So, hey Jane, how are you? So tonight we're going to be, hey Tracy, how are you? Tonight we're going to be chatting about, hey Christine, hey Francine, hey Nicole. Congratulations on being married, Nicole. Hey, Julie. All right, so we'll get started in a moment. Hey, Gregory. So tonight we're going to be chatting about FIRPTA. FIRPTA is a very, it's tricky. So we're going to kind of do a deep dive. And, these webinars always work best when you guys ask a lot of questions, you guys participate, kind of all that good stuff. So, hey, Britisha. So, all right. So obviously it's FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. All right. So let's kind of get started. As an agent, you need to know enough so that you're not creating any liability for yourself or your brokerage. So everybody on the call tonight, you guys all need to be commended because you're all thirsty for knowledge. So, it's a tricky area. Hey, Donna, how you doing? Both for foreign sellers and then also for your buyers, they can be domestic, USA citizens. But if they're purchasing a home from, from someone from out of the country, a foreigner, there is some potential liability for them. So we need to kind of make sure that we're advising them correctly. And really, this is very sophisticated and very, it's tricky. I mean, there's, I thought I knew, prior to this call. I did some more research today on it. There's a lot of information here. So really the bottom line is you should have both your foreign sellers and your domestic buyers, if they're thinking of purchasing a property from from someone who isn't a U.S. citizen, that they should consult a tax attorney or tax accountant so they know exactly, kind of what the potential risk for them as buyer is. And you as an agent, there's some risk there as well, for the brokers, the closing agents, pretty much everybody. So let's kind of get into it in a little bit more detail. So why did the IRS sort of institute FIRPTA? Well, basically, like everything, they want to collect their money. So what was happening, and FIRPTA goes back to like 1980, so it's been around a long time. There were some changes about 2 years ago, just in terms of what was withheld. Chat about those. So you need to understand it. If you are a listing agent with a foreign seller, or you're the buyer's agent and the seller is foreign. So FIRPTA, it's not a tax, right? It's a withholding. So just like, if we are all 1099 employees, right? So, but if you're working for a company and you're a W-2 employee, they withhold your tax, right? And then at the end of the year, they give you a W-2. They tell you how much was withheld, sent to the IRS, and then you do your tax return. And so this is basically the same thing. It's a withholding. So they're withholding money from the seller. So at closing, the title company will potentially withhold, money from the seller. So again, now if you're working with a seller, that's, foreign, and you're the listing agent. You need to tell them this is going to happen, right? You can't just tell them, oh, like the day of closing, oh, that $500,000 property we sold, 10 or 15% of that you're not getting. It's going to be withheld, until you file a tax return. So they probably would be pretty unhappy with that. So you would need to tell them that this is coming at them, in advance. And even if you're working with a foreign buyer and they're getting ready to buy something, you probably want to clue them into FIRPTA, because when they go to sell, FIRPTA will definitely apply to them. So, again, it's a withholding. It now is 15%, but there are some exemptions, right? So if the property is under 300K, there is an exemption that can be signed by a buyer. We're going to discuss that exemption in a little bit more detail on the next slide. And then no withholding is required. Now, again, because no withholding is required, that doesn't mean your seller doesn't have to pay taxes if they have a gain. They bought the property for $200,000. You're a great agent. You're going to sell it for $400,000. So there's a $200,000 gain. They have to pay capital gains tax just like we would as American citizens on that sale, right? So just because there isn't a withholding doesn't mean they aren't supposed to pay the tax, right? But it's a lot harder, for the IRS to go after them because they live in another country. But again, they are liable for that tax. So, but if the property is 300K or less, the listing agent will have potentially the buyer sign. It's an exemption, that allows for that withholding tax not to be collected. Now, if the property is between 300K and $1 million, the same exemption applies, but they're going to withhold 10% instead of the normal 15%. And then if the property is above 100K, a million, excuse me, if the property is above $1 million, there is no sort of exemption from it. The title company is going to withhold 15%. Actually, the buyer is responsible for withholding that tax, but kind of operationally, the title company does that. So those are kind of the three things. So that's what would be coming at your seller, if they're not a U.S. citizen. So is everybody good with that? Everybody kind of get that part of it? All right. So sounds like everybody's sounds like everybody's got that. All replying. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay. So now we're talking about the buyer, right? So the buyer. Okay. So the buyer, the property's under 300K. The listing agent wants that buyer, to sign the exemption, so there's no withholding for her client. So if it's under 300K, they can sign that. But what they're certifying is that they are going to live in that property, or a family member is going to live in that property, physically live in the property for half the year during the first 2 years. So if it's an investor buying that property, that's not going to apply. So then they can't sign that certificate, and that withholding tax for the seller is going to kick in. Everybody good? Everybody clear with that? Perfect. All right. Now, what happens? So now, if the buyer for some reason doesn't live in the property, they decide to sell the property, or they don't like it after they live there for 6 months, and they don't actually meet the 2 years, they're on the hook for that liability. So again, if it was 300K, potentially the IRS could come back to them for 45,000, which would be 15% of the 300,000. And they would be, they would potentially be liable, plus interest, penalties, and they're going to probably say, "Oh, I never knew about this." Who do you think they're going to have a problem with? Well, probably the title company, the closing agent, and probably the real estate agent, and probably the brokers as well. So that's why you got to know this, and that's why you got to make sure your buyer is informed as to kind of what they're certifying. So again, now if the property is between 300,000 and $1 million, that same exemption applies. You know, they if they live there half the year or more for the first 2 years, then instead of it being a 15% withholding, it's only 10%. So it's a little bit less. But again, you know, the IRS can come back to them for the deficiency. And then if the property is above, you know, 100K, excuse me, above a million, then there's a 15, that withholding is automatically going to happen. So you, as the buyer's agent, want to make sure that that withholding is being withheld, that the title company, you know, is actually holding that money, and then within 20 days, it has to be remitted to the IRS. So, and again, like, you know, would you be? I have a seller that is a U.S. citizen, works in Holland, and wants to sell their property. She will purchase a property in Holland with that equity. Well, all right. Well, again, because she's a U.S. citizen, this isn't going to apply. She's going to be filing a U.S. you know tax return. What the laws are in Holland, you know, when she goes to sell or buy, I have no idea. So I don't sell in Holland. I only sell in Florida. No, I just don't know, Andre. So that's a great question. But for her, it's not going to matter because she's a U.S. citizen. This is when somebody isn't a U.S. citizen and is not filing. You know, if they're an alien green card person, they're still filing a social. You know, they're still filing a tax return. So that's going to capture it there. It's when they don't file a tax return that really, I mean, everybody, you, me, all of us, we're all liable for this. But why we don't actually have to pay it um, is because when the closing agent wants to see the person's license, well, that's why, because then they know they're living in the United States, they have a U.S. driver's license, and they're probably subject to U.S. tax. So if the buyer doesn't meet the living in the prior requirement, the buyer is responsible to pay the withholding. Is that correct? Yes and no, Sherry. So they would be required to pay the withholding if the seller and the title company didn't withhold that money. So if no money is withheld, the liability then goes to the buyer. So again, even if that buyer isn't living in the property, they can still buy the property. You as the agent just have to make sure that that money is being withheld, and that's the key thing. So in that case, that is what the exemption. Sorry, I forgot to include that. Yeah, the exemption is when somebody lives there half. The requirement is they live there more than half the year. I think it's 180 days or 181 days for the first 2 years. Then they can file that exemption. But if something goes wrong, like they get transferred, or they don't like it and they have to sell, or they lose their job, blah blah blah, then they could potentially be liable. So that's why you really, when that buyer signs that, that exemption for the seller not to pay that, withholding tax, they really need to understand what they're signing. I mean, all the stuff kind of online, I mean, they would really want to have that house, right? I mean, or that condo or whatever it is. Like, it's got to be so good that they're willing to sign that and kind of take that chance, or they're so certain that nothing can go wrong. Um, she doesn't have a Florida driver's license or any evidence of living in that property. The 15. Well, I mean, she could probably give her U.S. passport. So as long as she's a U.S. citizen, Andre, it's not going to apply. If somebody's not a U.S. citizen, that's when that's going to kick in. Looks like we got Jill typing something. I know she's working with a client now that might have this issue. So let's see what she has to say before we chat a little bit further. There's no withholding under what could happen to the buyer if the affidavit is signed. They don't meet they become liable. The liability transfers to them. So again, if they didn't live there during, well, it's determined by how much time they live there is the basic test. So they'd have to live there for either themselves or an immediate family member. So like one of their children or their husband. Um, as long as they as long as they've lived there, I believe it's 181 days for 2 years. 181 days during year one plus 181 days during year two, and they can document and prove that to the IRS, and they're exempt, right? So then they're okay. Now again, because they're exempt, that doesn't get the seller off the hook, right? The seller's still supposed to pay that tax, but again, it's kind of hard for us, meaning the U.S. government, to collect that. Are the percentages different for international commercial buyers? My guess is probably not, Julie. I'd have to search that, but my guess would be it's going to be, I'd have to look, or you can look. I mean, if FIRPTA, I mean, that's kind of where it gets tricky. What is the seller's exposure when selling an existing property? Right. Exactly, Gregory. It's the tax on the profit. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide. It's think of it like this. They withheld money from your paycheck, but then you had your interest deduction, and then basically you came out, well, they withheld 15,000, but then your tax liability is only 5,000. You get a $10,000 refund. Same here. The seller, deposited, 20,000 in withholding, but in fact, they only owed 10,000. They would get 10,000 back. So it's the same concept. That's why it's a withholding. So they're withholding the money, and then you settle up with the IRS. If you owe more, you pay more. If you owe less, you get a refund. But it is tax on the profit. We're going to chat a little bit about that on the next um, on the next slide. So again, that seller often is, that foreign seller, you want to make sure they know that like this is going to happen. Like you're going on that listing appointment, or you're getting ready to sign them up on, for the listing agreement. You don't want to tell them after the thing goes under agreement that, you thought there's going to be 40, it's a $500,000 property. The buyer's not willing to, sign that exemption, and they're going to withhold $75,000 of your proceeds. They probably aren't going to be happy, right? That's kind of a surprise. They're going to get that money back, if there is any due to be gotten back. But that's why you want to be telling them all this up front, that, hey, Mr. Seller from Holland, hey, here's what I know. Here's some links, where you can do some research, and here's a great tax accountant that you might speak to kind of understand it, a little bit better. So let's move on to that next slide. So the next slide is, okay, so say you've got a $100,000 property, and they bought it for 500, and then they're selling it for 500, or they're netting 500, and there's really no gain, right? So there's going to be no tax. So the seller, can actually apply to the IRS. Typically, they're probably going to have an accountant or an attorney do this. There's going to be some cost, and then they're going to get a withholding certificate, and they're going to be able to get their money back from the title company. That's the only other way, is through this withholding certificate. And the withholding certificate is going to tell the title company or whoever's holding the proceeds there are no taxes due. Okay, that's a little bit faster. So say the house sold, in January of 2018, right? Well, they got to wait all the way to, next year to file 2018 tax return, right? So it's going to take them a little bit of time, maybe even up to a year, to kind of get their, to get their money back. So this withholding certificate, again, you would want to refer them to an accountant. You would want to refer them to a tax attorney. This isn't, you're just kind of telling them and making sure, they're going to the right professionals. So that's another way that they can actually sort of shorten the time their money is withheld. So that's really it. Looks like Evelyn has a question, so we'll wait for that to pop in here. And if anybody else has any other questions before we kind of summarize it, so to give you the quick summary, FIRPTA is tricky. I am under contract with a foreign seller for 100, and my buyer signed the FIRPTA. Is there another form, the FIRPTA exemption, Evelyn? Right. So basically, yep. So what's going to happen now? Again, you want to tell your buyer and make sure, hopefully, you already did this. She understands that, if for some reason she doesn't live there, right? She doesn't meet that requirement at the end, she could be liable for that, 15% of 135K. That's the whole thing. That's where the buyer's eyes need to be open, right? So sometimes, sometimes there's some pressure from that. Like you can say, no, I'm not signing it. You know, I'm not signing it. I still want to buy your property, but I'm not signing it. I'm not willing as the buyer to take on that responsibility, that potential risk, right? That's the whole thing. That's what you need to be telling, your client, or referring them to an accountant, a tax accountant, or a tax attorney, so that they tell them, right? That's what it is. So again, if you didn't sign that doesn't mean property. All it means is on that 135 day, instead of that exemption kicking in, the title company would have withheld 15% of the proceeds, and then the seller could have filed for that withholding certificate, or they could wait till next year, file their tax return, pay Uncle Sam, and then if there's a refund, they get that back. That's operationally how it works. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, it's definitely something everybody should know because, you know, in Florida, we probably have the highest percentage of foreigners owning property than anywhere in the country. So it's out there. If you're going to be practicing real estate, you are going to run into a foreign seller. It is going to happen, either as the buyer's agent or as the listing agent. And you just want to understand. And there's a whole bunch of blog articles, there's a whole bunch of, there's a lot of stuff online. What if it's a foreign corporation? I mean, we're not, there's too much here to really dig into all of it tonight. But, I mean, again, I deal with this a lot out a lot. Yeah, Ross, definitely. I mean, Disney, ton of foreign, I mean, everywhere in Florida. I mean, we have them here, you know, where I live on Treasure Island over by St. Pete. A lot of Canadians. I mean, they're here. They're great clients, and we want to help them, right? We all. I mean, that's what it's all about. We don't, and it always comes down to the same thing. No surprises. You don't want your client ever to be surprised. You're dealing with that seller, that foreign seller, and then you put that property under agreement. Oh, by the way, there's this thing called FIRPTA I forgot to tell you about. Probably not going to get a great review. Not going to be happy, right? But if you told them up front, right when you're doing the listing, hey, this is something that's going to happen. Hey, Paul, thank you. Then I mean, then what can they say? You told them. That's looks like foreign seller owner has home in Florida, will have to pay bought for 260K, sells for four. Yeah, I mean, well, again, Gregory, they might be able to only withhold 10% if you can get the buyer to sign that exemption with that, living there half the year, the first 2 years, then only 10% has to be withheld. But if the buyer's not willing to do that, then yeah, they're going to withhold $60,000. And again, all they're doing is they're withholding the money. It's just like if we're all 1099, but I'm sure we've all had W-2 jobs. They withhold the money, and then at the end of the year, you settle up, and you pay what you owe. And if you've overpaid, if more has been withheld, you get a refund, and that's the same thing, here. So it's just a withholding. So yep, but it looks like they've got $140,000 gain. Maybe they've dumped $50,000 into it. So really, their gain is only 90,000. Now I understand why some listing want occupants instead of an right. Exactly, because that's exactly because most sellers, it's like if they have a hard time with it because really what they're going to do, they're not going to pay the taxes. That's the thing. But I mean, again, they made a gain, they had a profit, you owe the money. So does the title company send the money for the withholding? Yes, yep, yep. It has to be, unless I believe we'd have to double check on this, Joe. But unless the seller is applying for that withholding certificate, like they know there's no gain, then I think the title company can hold it if they have. See, the thing is, you can't apply for the withholding certificate until you know what the purchase price is. So the property has to be under agreement, and they can apply. It typically takes 45 to 60 days for the IRS to send it, and then for the title company, you'd have to ask. I haven't run into a lot of it, and I mean, to fill out that certificate, the withholding certificate, probably you're going to have an accountant, CPA, tax attorney, somebody like that do it. Probably going to charge $1,000. So there's going to be some cost, but you're going to get your money back a lot sooner than if you just wait and kind of file your tax return. And you probably still, if you're someone from another country who has never, you're probably going to have somebody, complete that as well. All right. So again, when you have a foreign seller, remember this webinar. Go online, do some research. There's a ton of information out there. Make sure you're communicating to them. What's going to happen. If you're working with a buyer and they're getting ready to purchase a property, from a foreign seller, they need to understand, what their liability is. I mean, personally, I would be telling them, don't sign that exemption. Don't take the chance, right? Because you never know. Again, I mean, it's hopefully, again, the seller may not sell it to you because of that. It's how much do you want the house? All right, looks like we've got Helen typing in a question. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Helen. Yep, I'm glad we all have a little better understanding. Any last questions before we sign off? All right, good stuff. I'll wait a few minutes to see if hey, Jill, thank you. I'll see if anybody has any questions. Yeah, it's good info. It's something we all need to know. Helps us be a better agent. Well, a copy of you can. You can always watch you'll get an email so you can rewatch the presentation if you like. Are the rules for foreign buyers another session? There really are, Sylvia, there really are no rules for foreign buyers. The only rule or the only thing would be is that you would need to tell them that when they buy, eventually they may end up being a seller. FIRPTA is going to apply at that point. But in terms of them buying, there really is nothing that unless they're buying from a foreign seller. But if they're just buying from a regular seller, there's really nothing they need to be concerned with in terms of buying. But when they sell, you probably would want to clue them into FIRPTA. Shows you're very knowledgeable, and then maybe they sell 3 years down the road. They give you a call, you get the listing. All right, guys, I appreciate everybody tuning in. Good stuff. Have a great night. I'll hang in here for another minute or two and see if we've got any other questions. Okay, good. No, sorry, sold the property to. Yeah. Good stuff. But you might mention next time, kind of show you but no risk there. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you next Wednesday. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you. Bye bye. Sounds good, Sherry. Thank you.